The United States rejects a bid for an exemption from steel and aluminium tariffs that went into effect an hour ago. What will this mean for the future of the US and Australia relationship? I'm Patricia Karvelas, live from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. The Australian government has called the United States' decision to levy a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium imports on Australia as unjustified. The Prime Minister also ruled out imposing reciprocal tariffs. What will this mean for local industry and Australian consumers? I'll ask the Industry and Science Minister Ed Husic live in just a moment. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says he's known this debunked caravan terror plot was a hoax for some time. The explosives-laden caravan was discovered in Sydney in January alongside anti-Semitic material in what authorities now say was a fake terror plot. After the caravan was discovered, the coalition pursued the Prime Minister for weeks over what he knew and when. So was this a scare campaign? I'll ask my political panel, Allegra Spender and James Stevens. And new disaster support has been activated for those affected by ex-tropical cyclone Alfred in its aftermath. Residents will be offered a $1,000 payment for those affected with serious damage to their home or injury. I'll speak to Labor Senator Anthony Chisholm live from the clean-up side of Hervey Bay, Queensland, a little later. Let's begin with the top story today. Anthony Albanese this morning used the government's strongest language yet to reprimand the United States over their decision not to grant Australia an exemption from these universal 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium. Now, he said Australia will continue to engage with the United States, but the rejection was unfriendly. Here's what he had to say.
Such a decision by the Trump administration is entirely unjustified. This is against the spirit of our two nations' enduring friendship and fundamentally at odds with the benefits that our economic partnership has delivered over more than 70 years. Tariffs and escalating trade tensions are a form of economic self-harm and a recipe for slower growth and higher inflation. They are paid by the consumers. This is why Australia will not be imposing reciprocal tariffs on the United States. Such a course of action would only push up prices for Australian consumers and increase inflation.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton, on the other hand, says if he's elected, he believes he can strike a deal with the Trump administration to have an Australian exemption against the tariff. That's despite no countries so far securing a carve-out. Now, Mr Dutton says Anthony Albanese has failed to stand up for the country.
This is a bad day for Australia. A bad day because of the decision that our ally in America has made. But even worse because the Prime Minister is on his knees and can't even get a phone call or a meeting with the President of the United States, our closest ally. And I just think the Prime Minister has let every Australian down. The coalition government was able to negotiate an exemption largely because we were able to prosecute our argument more effectively than what Anthony Albanese can.
Well, that was the opposition leader making his criticism of the government's approach on tariffs. For the government's perspective, let's bring in Industry and Science Minister Ed Husic. Minister, welcome to the program.
Hi, Patricia.
Is this the way you treat a good friend and ally?
Well, let's call a spade here. I mean, I think this is a dog act after over a century of friendship. Australians have stood by and stood with Americans for many, many decades. In fact, Australians have spilt blood alongside Americans in different conflicts. We have stood together not just from a national security perspective, but from an economic security perspective as well, trying to improve trade relationships between countries because it's good for economies and it's good for workers when done right. And what we've seen here, what's it been for? It's been, when you look at the total number, even based on US data, of Australian imports of steel and aluminium, Australian imports count in terms of steel 1% of those imports. And when it comes to Australian aluminium imports into the US, 2% of their market. And frankly, at the end of the day, when you look at it, Australian steel and aluminium is prized globally for its quality. It has a lot of markets, it reaches a lot of markets, and ultimately if the US wants to pay more for a quality product, it's on them, but it is no way to treat an ally and friend in the way that this has happened.
One of the reasons that's been identified from the United States of why they want to take this action is that bringing in these products is a threat to impair national security. We are in the strongest defence and security alliance with the United States. Should that alarm us?
I think it ultimately, a lot of the arguments that have been made in relation to applying these tariffs to Australia by members of the Trump administration defy fact and reality. The reality is Australian aluminium and steel has been sought after by our US friends because of its quality. I think ultimately too, I think this is an important point to make. Australians and Americans as a people are very strong friends. We get on closely as a people, and I think the people-to-people contact will be important, even if the administration takes positions, as the Prime Minister has rightly pointed out, are completely and utterly unjustified.
Ed Husic, does the decision not to give Australia an exemption show that it's time for the government to stand up to Donald Trump? Is this a moment for our country that being polite just doesn't work?
Well, I think we do need to speak up for our nation. We do need to speak up for our industry. We do need to speak up for the value of the friendship between our two countries, as I indicated a few moments ago. Australians and Americans get on very strongly and have had a history of mateship spanning a century plus. I think that is something to stand up for, but where decisions are taken against our country's interest, we should stand up, as the Prime Minister has rightly stood up today. And I might just make this point as well, if you don't mind. I think this is a moment, a Team Australia moment, where we should all, regardless of our political views, be speaking up on behalf of our country. I am staggered that Peter Dutton, an appeaser, has spoken up in a way that he has today, not to speak up for the country, but to speak up for his political interest, and to suggest in the face of reality that he could have somehow got a better outcome if he had spoken to Donald Trump, defies the reality that these tariffs have been set across the board.
I've got to pick you up on the word
that Peter Dutton will put his...
How is he an appeaser?
He has not... Well, where has he stood up for the country, frankly? Where has he stood up for the nation and said this is wrong? His first port of call was not to speak up against the Trump administration's decision and not to speak up in the way that the Prime Minister did. Peter Dutton's first port of call was to make a political point. That is the point that should be emphasised here. As I said a few weeks ago when we spoke, a lot of these people in the coalition side, it's Team Australia when they're in office and it's Team Coalition when they're not, rubbing their hands at the misfortune of the country at the hands of the Trump administration.
The coalition has said it would mend what they've described as a critically broken relationship with the US, and the opposition leader says if there's a change of government, he'll do a deal with the Trump administration. So he thinks he can get a deal. Do you think there is a deal to be made?
Well, other nations, the heads of state of other nations have gone to the US and sought to directly negotiate on that, and they have fallen to the same fate as we have, having a deal with tariffs. So Peter Dutton saying that he can do that simply smacks of unbelievability. But as we know, what do we expect? I mean, he reckons he'll fly to the US and be able to do that. I mean, I'm not going to take travel advice from a bloke who left his own electorate to go and raise funds for his political campaign ahead of a cyclone.
Can I just say, though, he has been critical of the Prime Minister not being able to get Donald Trump on the phone and not travelling to the US. So let's deal with these two things separately. Firstly, the phone. Is he right to critique the Prime Minister for not being able to raise Donald Trump and getting him on the phone? Clearly the Prime Minister's been trying and hasn't been successful since that last call.
Well, the PM, well, and you're right to make that absolute addition at the end of your question, which is the PM previously spoke with President Trump about this, where it was indicated that great consideration would be given to an exemption. Officials across government, both here and in the US administration, had been talking extensively on this, and it hasn't come to pass because a uniform position has been placed. So, again, Peter Dutton, his comments defy reality, but they always go to what Peter Dutton prioritises before the country is his own political interest. He always values his political interest above national interest every single time. So let me put
this to you. Are you concerned that the Prime Minister has found it difficult since the last conversation to get Donald Trump on the phone?
Well, again, I come back to my point. We have worked across government, both here and our representatives in the US, to be able to make that case, had meaningful dialogue, but ultimately they have made a decision to apply this across the board. And so, again, I would go back to the point that the Prime Minister made, unjustified. They work against economic interests. They work against the fight against inflation. But ultimately, our steel and aluminium products are highly valued because we make a quality product. And if the US wants to pay more for it, that's on them. But we will continue to do what we do, which is to offer this product in different corners of the globe, and they're received gladly and eagerly.
Don Farrell spoke a little earlier. He's the Trade Minister, of course, for those who don't know. And he said he didn't believe the US ever wanted to give an exemption, looking back on it now. So did they lie to us?
Well, for US officials and members of the Trump administration, they should step forward and say whether or not they were fair dinkum about it. From our point of view, we were fair dinkum. From our point of view, we were standing up for our country. From our point of view, we believe that it's right that two countries that have shared and been mates for over a century should treat each other better, and we've stood up for the value of that friendship. And it's on others to be able to explain their positions.
You said this was a dog act by the US, right? Strong words. So if it's a dog act by the US, how can we be in this AUKUS deal with them and rely on them when, you know, the precedent, according to you, is that they operate in a dog act kind of way?
Well, I believe that those arrangements that have been set up across three nations, I think, you know, those things have been set. The work has been done and commenced. The fact that we have made commitments in terms of the purchase of the submarines and the breadth of that agreement, and the fact that within the US Congress it's highly valued as well. I think that speaks to the strength of that commitment. But again, there is no point in us pussyfooting around, and when a decision has been made that's contrary to our nation's interest, we should stand up and speak up on that, as the Prime Minister has, and not engage in political games the way that Peter Dutton has, where his first port of call, as I said, is to make a political point and not call out an action against the country in what I would label is a form of appeasement by him. OK,
so Australians watching might think they're not a very reliable partner. Why are we sticking with them?
Well, because, as I said earlier, Australians and Americans as a people get on very strongly. We have had, I think, over a century of mateship. We have worked together over decades on national security and economic interest. And just because one administration has made a call against that does not undermine the strength of friendship between our two countries. And we have to think into the long term, the durability and the strength of that. And I think that should be rated above all else.
The Prime Minister has confirmed that he only found out, he was only made aware that Australia was not being exempt from tariffs this morning. Shouldn't Donald Trump had told him directly? Doesn't that show a lack of respect for our country?
Well, I reckon he should have, but I also want to say that I'm proud of the fact that we've got an Australian Prime Minister that has worked so hard across government and with our representatives in the US to stand up for our country's interests, and have called that out today in terms of the impact of the decision being unjustified. It is not the act of friendship, and I'm proud of the fact that we have a Prime Minister who's made that call.
OK, but he's being painted by Peter Dutton, as you've said, as not working hard enough on this, as not being able to do the deal. You're establishing a very different case. How are people going to work this out? Should he have been more active? Should he have been, like, working the phone more and got himself on an aeroplane, thought about different ways of being creative here?
Well, I think I'm going back over points, but I will emphasise 3 quick points. One, again, we have worked across government on this. From the Prime Minister down, we have been working to secure this deal. Ultimately, the Trump administration made a decision across everyone, making a uniform decision on this matter. And third, and finally, Peter Dutton, he can make all sorts of claims. I think most people will see that this bloke is a lot of hot air, flying against the face of reality, fact, to make and score a political point. What he should be doing is standing with in a Team Australia moment, speaking as one instead of dividing. But again, what do you expect out of a bloke like Peter Dutton, whose stock in trade is to always divide and to always score a political point, no matter what that means in terms of national interest.
Now, before I get in trouble for going over my time, as I find this topic very interesting, just solutions. Paul Farrow, the National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, has said that Australian steel and Australian aluminium must be mandated for use in all Australian infrastructure and government buildings from this point on. Is that something you'll do?
We took to the last election a commitment, a Buy Australian plan. We recognise the value of government procurement. When governments go and buy goods and services, if they buy them from Australian companies, it actually is good not only for government, but it's good for the economy, for those companies, for jobs longer term. We just in the last week, Patricia, have strengthened the definition of what an Australian firm is so that we don't have green and gold washing, that true blue Australian firms are able to get access to supply goods and services to government.
Could you go
further? And in terms of Paul Farrow and the Australian... Well, I was just going to get to the point.
Thanks.
In terms of Paul Farrow's comments, obviously we will keep an open mind. We took a strong stand to protect Australian steel making recently with our decision with respect to Whyalla. We've also introduced the green aluminium production credit to strengthen aluminium production into the long term, which was criticised, mind you, by the coalition who don't support Australian aluminium making. And so we will maintain an open mind and work where we can to absolutely give opportunities for Australian industry to supply goods and services, be they steel, aluminium or other products.
Ed Husic, many thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Many thanks for your time.
Well, US President Donald Trump's top trade advisor, Pete Navarro, spoke to our North America correspondent, Carrington Clark, about why exemptions had not been granted, unlike the one granted to Australia during the first Trump administration.
So what the lesson from the first Trump tariffs has been is that exemptions to anybody are counterproductive. They don't work for the American people. And the same thing is true of product exclusions.
To discuss this further, let's bring in a former Labor leader and former ambassador to the United States, Kim Beazley. Kim Beazley, lovely to speak to you.
Nice to talk to you too, Patricia. It's a pretty unedifying debate, but there we are.
It is unedifying, and let's have that unedifying debate. The White House has confirmed it won't grant Australia or anyone else an exemption. Is Australia responsible for failing to get that carve-out?
Well, of course they're not going to do that. They're not going to give us an exemption because the terms and conditions and reasons it really for the current rounds of tariffs is not exclusively or even mainly protection of US industry. That was so in the first Trump administration. Now it's about revenue raising, and we do need, as we approach the Americans, to understand what the real rationales are behind what they're doing. They're trying to raise money because Trump's caught in a pincer. Trump's not too worried about debt, and he certainly doesn't want the debt ceiling around. He'd like to abolish that, and that's actually quite sensible. But you've got one set of Republicans in the Congress deeply concerned for a balanced budget, at least, if not a surplus budget. And then you've got a set of tax cuts and some expenditures that Trump wants to put in place as a product of his election campaign promises. And they're nowhere near being able to reconcile those objectives, nowhere near it. And they're not going to get to where they need to be by doing the tariffs, but they're closer than when they're not doing the tariffs.
Right, so they're doing it as a revenue raiser, you reckon?
Yeah, mainly.
Peter Dutton
and you need
says,
to actually understand that.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. So Peter Dutton says if he's elected, he'll get a deal with Trump on an exemption. Could he get it, or is it just...
I wouldn't set that up as a test for yourself if I were he. Because were he to win the next election in the next couple of months, I don't think you'd get Trump to re-look at this in that period of time. But for either he or Prime Minister Albanese, there may be opportunities 12 months, whatever, down the track for us to work through on this again. You'll remember last time, I think it took about 9 months to get a favourable conclusion. And one of the things you know about the contemporary American administration, they do change their minds. And you might well see a set of circumstances occur where they do that again insofar as we're concerned. So there is an interest, we've got an interest in keeping going like the current government has been, with a constant pressure and lobbying associated with the administration, because you never know when the worm might turn.
Are you surprised Anthony Albanese has struggled to get President Trump even on the phone?
Look, if you take a look at what's happening in the United States, they've been struggling to get a situation where they can actually spend money, tax, or do all the things that they need to do as Congress has handled approvals for expenditures and government activity. So that's been in crisis over the course of the last week. And at the heart of that crisis has been the involvement of Donald Trump. I would have thought that he was pretty heavily engaged. And in the middle of that, an Australian Prime Minister or anyone else coming in and saying, you ought not to be doing this, when you actually know what their view is, because Albanese has always already expressed it to him, you probably wouldn't pick up the phone.
Right.
You would probably want to keep going as you had been. If he was ringing up to say that there's a real crisis in the immediate approaches to Australia, he'd have picked up the phone. Well, he's not going to pick up the phone when he knows what the position is, what the arguments are, and he has decided, because he needs the money, that he's going to keep on going with these tariff proposals. It's not a friendly act, but it's also not a crippling act, and there'll be times to revisit it.
Should he have travelled to Washington? Because that's the argument made by the opposition. Obviously, you're a Labor man. I understand that you're probably pretty sympathetic to the way the government's handled this, but, you know, being as objective as you possibly can be, Kim Beazley, would a trip to Washington have made much of a difference in your view? Not
at all. As I said, you've got to get back to the reason why this situation is occurring. It's not occurring as it was the previous time, where there's an argument going on about the needs of American manufacturing industry and how it's been let down by the fact that over the years, the United States has been the market for everybody, which has been an act of extraordinary decency. It's an act I hope they can keep up with, but Trump seems unhappy with it. And I don't think that in the circumstances where that's not the major reason is he needs the money, he's going to change his mind on that at a point of time when he is arguing the toss with Congress on the structure of the budget and what he needs to be, what he wants and what they want out of him on expenditures and on taxes and the rest of it. You plunk in the middle of the main American debate, and we are not relevant to the main American debate. We may become relevant. We may become a subject of interest to them, other things coming up, other things they might want from us, and therefore we need to keep the lobby going.
Okay, so let me
And Rudd's as good at that as anyone else is.
Well, he's certainly kind of been hustling. Maybe hasn't had success, but he seems to have been working pretty hard on this. You've warned that the government needs to lift military spending to at least 3% of GDP in line, as it turns out, with US demands. Why should we lift it to that level, Kim Beazley?
Because we do need to defend ourselves, and the region around us is not getting any better, and it won't. And when you look at our levels of expenditure in times past, of course in World War II, and we don't need to replicate that, but we were at 34% of GDP. In the Vietnam War, we were between 4 and 5. When the Vietnam War ended, we dropped down to between 2.5 and 3, and that's where it was and was maintained when I was the Defence Minister. It changed as we took a sort of peace bonus in the 1994 White Paper when we said 2% of GDP is what should be a target on defence, which is quite a way below 2.5 to 3, which is where it had been, but quite understandable in the circumstances of the Berlin Wall coming down and what was then a very strong and warm relationship between the United States and China and between ourselves and China. The world has changed and the world has become very insecure, and nobody owes us a living, and we need to be very careful that we can look after ourselves as best we can and be a reliable ally as far as our main guarantor is concerned, the United States.
Well, let's go to our main guarantor, because many Australians are very nervous that our main guarantor isn't kind of as reliable and trustworthy as we have been used to. AUKUS. It's been criticised as being very one-sided, that it really relinquishes our sovereignty, given the unpredictability of the United States. Should we be having a plan B, even if it's quietly being worked on by the government? I mean, if you're in power right now, would you be thinking, this doesn't look as reliable as it once was?
Problem with announcing that you've got a plan B, everybody has plan Bs. But announcing you have a plan B, other people who need to be held up to the mark on plan A go into a mode of relaxation, which is exactly not where you want them. So we have to pursue plan A because it is the best plan.
Okay. So they're not going to... Well, let me just interrupt. I don't mean to be rude, but OK, so they won't tell us that they're working on a plan B, but would they be?
I have no idea.
But would you? Would you?
See,
if you're in power now, would you be thinking, my partner's unreliable, I better be looking at other options?
In the case of the partner, I would say that's yet to be demonstrated. The Americans get a lot out of us in security terms. We are if the Americans want a position in the Western Pacific, we are the last bastion. And we do a great deal for them and they do a great deal for us. But that great deal is one that the Americans would keep rattling around. And so, and with that level of confidence, I think that we can be confident. But nobody can be confident about everything at all times. And therefore, we need to be able to defend ourselves as best we can to deter anyone trying to take advantage of any doubts about anything in our strategic settings. Hence, we probably need to get back to the sort of expenditures we had in the couple of decades immediately after the Vietnam War.
So, final question. Do the Americans believe we'd ever walk away? I mean, don't they have to believe we'd walk away? Don't we have to be tough in some way in order for us to ensure we're getting a good deal here, if I can use the current president's language?
Look, we are getting a very good deal on the submarine.
But don't we need to be playing a bit more tough around these sorts of things?
Well, you know, one of the things I think I found out when I was ambassador, but I knew it anyway, I knew it from my time as a minister, is that the conversation between us and the Americans is high level and intense all the time. We are deeply embedded in their technical intelligence structures in the United States, courtesy of what we've got at Pine Gap. We are, and we are enormously appreciated for that reason. We are constantly calling in ships and doling out ships, constantly. I would say that the public and the media in Australia is aware of about, I'd say, 2 to 3% of the interactions between Australia and the United States. No more than that. And at the levels of the most important in terms of our security, you're not aware at all. So, you know, the generalities, that's because we try to keep things out of the hands of people who may wish us harm, and we also need to be able to keep in a situation where we have that close discussion, and that discussion can be conducted with total frankness. And we do. So I was very pleased to be part of that when I was ambassador for 6 years. From all I've heard of Mr. Rudd, who's not actually been the best friend of mine over the years politically, but he seems to be doing pretty well at keeping these issues before the Americans and being trusted by them. In particular, we have built up a stack of support in Congress, and that's going to be particularly valuable over the next, as we continue to discuss AUKUS.
It could be a bumpy ride. Kim Beazley, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.
Lovely to talk to you. It's always a bumpy ride, Patricia. Never gets much better.
Well, that's how we live. These are our times. Kim Beazley,
that's our
thank
times.
you. Well, let's bring in my political panel for today. Independent MP for Wentworth, Allegra Spenter. Shadow Assistant Minister for Government Waste, James Stephens. Hello, welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Patricia. Good to be with you.
Now, James, I spoke with Minister Ed Husic before. He described the American decision in relation to not giving us an exemption as a dog act. Is that what it is?
Well, it's extremely disappointing, and obviously, being from South Australia, it's particularly acutely felt here in Adelaide because we've got a steelworks out at Whyalla that is in a very precarious situation, and any bad news for our steel exports obviously puts a bit of a lump in your throat about what the future might be for that plant and the thousands of people employed there. So obviously we're hoping for the best as far as Whyalla is concerned, and obviously we hope that the US administration will reconsider what they've done here. But I'm just very worried about the ability of our government to communicate with the US administration and whether or not we're missing out on the best interests of our country being served right now, given we can't even seem to get a phone call between our Prime Minister and the President.
Well, I'll put that to you, Allegra. Obviously, that's been part of the story today. The US President wanted to go ahead with blanket tariffs. I spoke with Kim Beazley a moment ago and he said that, you know, of course he didn't want to have a call because he doesn't want to change his mind. Do you accept that?
Look, I think it is really disappointing that the US has made this decision, that Trump has made this decision, and I don't think this is the treatment of, should be the treatment of a country like Australia where we've got a good relationship or have had over a long period of time. You know, I think our focus should be on, you know, keeping on trying to have those discussions ongoing, see if we can reverse that decision, but also more broadly, I think focus on firstly, how do we, you know, assert Australia's interests in relation to Donald Trump and and the US administration, and also get our own industries more competitive, which is about doing things like passing EPBC laws that are better for business and for the environment, and IR laws as well that work better for business. So, in terms of that conversation, I'm really disappointed that this is where the US has landed, that there hasn't been a conversation more recently between the Prime Minister and Trump. And I think the focus has to be on continuing to assert Australia's position and the strength that Australia brings to this relationship and the value.
James, your leader, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, today said that he could get a deal with Donald Trump. No one has got a deal on this. What makes your side of politics so confident that you'd be different than everyone else in the whole world?
Well, Patricia, we've done it before, of course, under the Turnbull administration. And in fact, I remember being with Malcolm Turnbull. He was in Adelaide on the South Australian election trail in 2018. His phone was glued to his ear talking to Joe Hockey, who had excellent relationships with the Trump administration senior officials. And back then, I think it was those relationships, the work that our ambassador had done to build and connect with the key people that have influence that meant we could get the deal that we've got, and that doesn't seem to be the case anymore, which is extremely regrettable. And I don't know, what Kevin Rudd has been able to do to progress making our case, but today's announcement is that whatever he's done has been unsuccessful. So we've done it before, and I'm very confident that we can do it again. OK,
I have to challenge you on that on the basis of actually the very man you've quoted, Malcolm Turnbull, says that he's made it clear he doesn't think it's the same this time round and that it would be as easy this time round. I mean, isn't he the most reliable person, given he pulled it off last time and doesn't think it'll be the same this time? And clearly it wasn't.
I don't think Donald Trump has changed a lot at all since the first time he was president. He might be, have a little bit more experience the second time round and some different people around him. But he's a deal maker, always has been, still is, very, very proud of it. And deals with him tend to involve, firstly, that direct interaction with him and the senior people that advise him and that he listens to. And also, having a case and an argument and presenting to him with a reason why it's good for him. Now, we're not even getting these conversations occurring whatsoever. I think that's beyond question the problem here.
That's an interesting point. Allegra Spender, I want to bring you in on that question of, is this the same Trump? There are lots of changes, at least, to the sort of ferocity of this administration and its kind of organisation, if you like. Do you think they're just the same?
Look, I think it seems to be quite a different administration than the first time round. There may be some parallels, and I agree that Trump is a deal maker. But in terms of the aggression with which they have executed and the speed at which they have executed the agenda of Trump is I think, has taken the whole world, I think, by surprise, and has been quite at a different level to last time. And I think, really, that you can say that in relation to tariffs, but you can say that in relation to Ukraine, and you can say that in relation to Elon Musk and Doge and firing, and stopping US aid, all these different things. It's just, this is a different scale of administration. I feel like this is quite a different administration than it was last time.
In terms of a deal, Stephen Hamilton, who's an economist, has said today, I can confidently say that the price we would have to pay to avoid having to find alternative buyers for just 0.13% of our exports would simply not be worth paying. James, I mean, would it be worth paying in terms of offsetting the loss there?
Look, I think the real concern is whether or not this is the beginning of a whole range of other export industries that are important to us having similar sorts of treatment put upon them. And to be fair to the Trump administration, they're talking up many more broader, wider tariffs into the future, and we could get caught up, as we have over the decades, I might add, in some of these trade wars where we've done nothing wrong between the US and Europe, for example, in the agricultural space. That was very common through the 80s and 90s. And so we could see a lot of other products, not just steel and aluminium, affected, which is why it's so important to make a clear, firm stand and work as hard as we can to make it clear that it's not about the product, it's about the relationship between Australia and the United States. We have a free trade agreement. They have a trade surplus with Australia. We've got a long history in the national security space of being very strong, close, loyal allies. We don't want to be fighting with each other over things like tariffs. We can't let it start with steel and aluminium and move into, say, wine, red meat, a whole range of other important products and have this turn into a trade war when Australia is a trading nation. It's vitally important to us that we have and defend and support free trade around the world.
Allegra, go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to jump in on that and just say, look, I think from an economic point of view, the greater risk to Australia is not our trade with the US. Our greater risk is that we are, as you describe, an open trading nation. And frankly, we trade much more with China and with other countries in our region. And the more that they are battered by trade tariffs with the US, which we have very little or almost no control over, that is what is going to hurt us. And so that is why I think our investment should be on building those multilateral relationships in Asia, but also with Europe, strengthening those relationships. And then secondly, building our competitiveness. And I think that's really the point that we all need to be focused on right now. Australia's got a productivity slump. We are going to enter a more difficult time in terms of competitiveness around the world as people slap different types of tariffs and, retaliation all over the shop. What we need to do is control our own ability for our businesses to respond and our businesses to be effective here.
Very short answer on this. In fact, just a couple of sentences. Starting with you, Allegra Spender. Are you entirely comfortable with us being in this AUKUS deal given the way that we've seen the US behave here?
Yeah. Look, our security relationship with the US goes longer than the time of any one presidency. So I think that, and these ties are deep. But I think we should make sure that we have scrutiny over AUKUS to make sure that we are making those milestones. And I think assess very much our defence expenditure more broadly to make sure that we are able to look after ourselves as well as have those relationships with America and others.
I'll give you that question as well, James.
Well, Patricia, I'm 100% supportive of us pursuing every aspect of the AUKUS opportunity. I'm from Adelaide. We'll be making the submarines here. That capability will be transformative for the Royal Australian Navy and our nation's ability to defend ourselves and our interests into the future.
Thank you to both of you. Let's meet again and have another chat. Thanks.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks, Allegra.
Well, joining me next, of course, is Andrew Chisholm, who joins us from Queensland. He's going to join us to talk about the disaster relief scheme. I think he joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, PK.
Anthony Chisholm. I misnamed you. How rude of me. I just want to talk to you about what you're doing there. Just give me a sense of what's going on in Hervey Bay. I think that's where you are.
Yeah, it is, PK, and I was actually here last week and it looked like they were going to avoid the worst of the cyclone, but Saturday, Sunday, they got hit by a massive rain event that did a lot of damage. It had an impact on businesses, it had an impact on schools, and it had an impact on households as well. Quite an elderly community here. There's a number of sort of low-set high-rise along the waterfront, and a lot of those have taken on water in their basements. That's had a really devastating impact on the electricity and also the lift systems that operate in there. So I think for a number of those places, it's going to be a longer-term recovery as a result of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Anthony, that obviously last week there was a lot of coverage from everyone, and often what happens is that after the kind of disaster moves on, less of a focus here. Just give me a sense of how dire things are. I mean, I know we're at the recovery phase, but how are people going? You've obviously spoken to people on the ground there.
Yeah, it's been a good opportunity to be here on the ground and talk to people, and conscious in particular in this part of the world that Keith Pitt, the local member, has obviously vacated because he's been appointed to the Holy See as our ambassador. So I think it was important for the government to be here, announce the support that they're providing, but also just be on the ground and be able to talk to people. I went to one of those high-rise apartments that's been impacted. I went to the recovery centre. There's a school that's had about 6 classrooms that have been inundated by water that still isn't operational. So there's still a lot of effort going on to ensure that they can clean up and get their buildings and get their school facilities and houses back. But there's no doubt that there's going to be people displaced for a period of time.
Now, you've activated new disaster payments today. The Greens were out earlier saying recovery payments should be doubled. Just talk to me about what you've offered and whether you think that there should be a look at this again, given we're seeing so many people really devastated by these events.
There's always a multitude of payments that are made as part of this recovery process. So yesterday, the state government, in conjunction with the federal government, announced disaster relief that would apply to the Fraser Coast, which is where I am today. Today, the federal government extended its disaster payment in terms of its assistance grants that will be paid to those impacted here in Harvey Bay. And they go to those people really in a difficult position. Those people that have had a really bad impact on their residents. They might have had an injury as a result of the damage that's been done. And that's federal government payment goes to. As the impact becomes more clear, there is additional payments that can be made from the state and federal government. That's something that we are working constructively with the state government on, and also with local government. I've spent a day here with the mayor where we've been touring around together, and I've got a good understanding of the challenge that they'll face over the next coming months.
Thank you so much for joining us, Senator, and good luck out there.
Thanks, Peter.
Tesla, the Elon Musk-owned electric vehicle company's shares have been plummeting in the past few weeks, with sales slumping in Europe and Australia. Now, it's fuelled in part by a backlash against its billionaire owner, Elon Musk, with protests at more than 50 Tesla showrooms across the US just last week. He's received a perhaps unsurprising endorsement overnight from President Donald Trump when he vowed to buy one to support Mr. Musk. Here he was in a photo op outside the White House where Musk delivered 5 Tesla models.
I'm going to buy because, number one, it's a great product, as good as it gets. And number two, because this man has devoted his energy and his life to doing this. And I think he's been treated very unfairly by a very small group of people. And I just want people to know that you can't be penalized for being a patriot. And he's a great patriot.
Well, to discuss this and more, let's bring in my regular Wednesday Big Tech panel, Capital Brief's James Hennessy and national technology reporter Ange Lavoisier. Welcome to both of you. What an endorsement, James. What's going on with Tesla here? Is this damage irreparable? It is wild. People with stickers on their cars, I've seen them sort of, try to distance themselves from Tesla. What's going on?
Yeah, it is a pretty wild situation we're in at the moment with Tesla. You know, many people would say that Donald Trump occasionally has the affect of a car salesman, and here he was out in front of the world actually being one with Elon. Now, there are a few interesting dynamics that are kind of going on at the moment. So the first one is obviously political, and that's what you were sort of alluding to just now. The fact that Elon Musk has associated himself pretty closely with Donald Trump. He's obviously running the Department of Government Efficiency and running these sort of cost-cutting enterprises from slightly outside the White House. And obviously one of the big business consequences of that is that if you associate really closely with one political tendency, you're going to alienate a lot of customers. This has become quite heated in the United States and beyond, with lots of protests at Tesla dealerships. But there are a couple of other things going on as well. As you said, there's been a dramatic fall in Tesla's stock price over the past couple of months. Since December, it has fallen 50%. Now, it's important to remember that it did actually surge after Donald Trump's election, along with a lot of the stock market initially. A lot of people were coasting on the fumes of the fact that the stock market did incredibly well under Donald Trump's first presidency. But there's a couple of interesting dynamics playing out this time. So obviously, Musk received what I would call sort of the president's friend premium when you're so closely aligned with Donald Trump, obviously when he gets in, the stock is going to pump. But Tesla is actually facing a few problems that are not political. It is being squeezed along a few different dimensions. It's facing problems with competitors that are emerging in China. China has become an absolute hotbed of EV development, and they're putting out a lot of cheaper and quite effective EVs from companies like BYD and Xiaomi. I'm sure a lot of people in Australia would have seen, at the very least, BYD or Build Your Dreams cars puttering about the city streets. And so they're releasing cheaper EVs that are squeezing Tesla in some of its key markets, including the US, China and Europe and also Australia. So Elon is kind of in a tough position here. Tesla has always traded at quite an insane premium for what its sales actually look like, and it kind of trades as being almost like an index fund for the future. The people who really are invested in Tesla stock tend to think, look, their car sales might not be touching what Ford is selling, but when Elon Musk at some point, he's going to flip the switch and usher in the future of everything, be it cars or robots or whatever. And that myth is kind of falling apart.
Yeah, that myth is falling apart, really well put. And obviously this is pretty significant brand damage if you look at kind of the economic impact. I think James is right, it's more complex than just this, but how do you deal with the brand damage of this enormity? I mean, he's kind of really embedded himself in the Trump administration with Doge. It's not some fleeting moment, it's not just some friendship. He's always in the Oval Office.
I don't know if there's a crisis management firm in the world who could tell you how to deal with this kind of brand damage, because, it's not just in the US, it's global. The latest car sales figures from Australia show that Tesla sales have plummeted here as well. So it's not just that kind of polarisation in the US, it's to do with Musk's global brand. And you're even seeing, I mean, look, these are just think pieces, but you are sort of seeing speculation that Donald Trump will need to part with Elon Musk because his brand is that toxic, having been the face and the voice of Doge and, the havoc that's wreaking in the US. So, Musk may have benefited from the association, and Trump may see it that way too, and may, ultimately want to cut ties if his stocks keep plummeting like this. Although, you weren't seeing that today outside the front of the White House. They're pretty locked in for now.
Yeah, I just want to ask you one follow-up if I can, Ange. Like that stunt where Donald Trump's, really into the cars and he's basically done an ad for his cars. Who's that for? I mean, obviously not the boycotting public because they have a fixed view. Is this for like MAGA people to go out and get electric cars, which some of them seem ideologically not that into?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's for the base, I suppose. Far be it from me to make sense of the kind of the political strategy coming out of the White House at the moment. Yeah, you're right. Who is that for? I couldn't tell you. One more thing, though, that did jump out at me, as part of that push that Donald Trump is making, saying, this is illegal and, this boycott is illegal. Important to point out that it's not. It's protected by the First Amendment in the US. It's protected by free speech in the Constitution, and that was affirmed by the Supreme Court in 1972, the consumer's right to protest against private companies. So, yeah, I mean, it could have just been about going after the enemy, right? The left, the opposite.
Now, there's some other tech news, Ange. News Corp Australia has announced the launch of News GPT. It's a generative artificial intelligence tool designed for internal use. It makes them one of the earliest and most advanced adopters of AI in media. Robots writing our news, is that what's going to happen? And I will, I've worked there. I worry for the journalists. What are the implications there?
Yeah, I think the line that was used in the memo from their chief technical officer to staff was that News GPT would be supporting the creative process. So, we're not replacing you. It's here to help you. It's here to support you, which, of course, the staff there, the editorial staff, would be nervous, I imagine, and understandably so. And they're not the only industry to be feeling that. It is being rolled out this week progressively. We're expecting it to be there to sort of rolled out more widely on Friday. Yeah, I think it's. I mean, it's interestingly they've got that partnership with OpenAI that was announced back in May, I think, of last year. There was a deal that was signed, quite a valuable one, between News Corp internationally and OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT. But interestingly, this is an in-house proprietary tool that draws on several different models, not just ChatGPTs. I think what they're really trying to do here, potentially, as well as, you know, maybe bring down the costs of production, let's be honest, they're a business, is also something that a lot of businesses of all kinds are trying to do at the moment, which is make sure that their staff aren't putting sensitive in-house data into these models that are, you know, not in-house. Like, you can't just put this sort of sensitive information in there. But I think a lot of people are, and you know, that's other news orgs as well. I mean, what I will say in News Corp's defence is, yes, they have been an early adopter. You know, they've said, you know, back in 2023 that they were, News Corp Australia, that they were churning out thousands of AI, or, you know, largely AI-generated articles on things like weather and sport. But, you know, I think there is a bit of iceberg theory here at play, where you probably have, in fact, you definitely have journalists at other organisations who are using these tools in all kinds of workplaces to support their work, to give them ideas, or, you know, however, and they're not necessarily declaring it. So what they're trying to do here is make a more safe and secure version of it.
Is this inevitable at other news organisations too, James? Is this just the new normal?
Yeah, well, I'll back everything that Anne's just said, but there's another interesting dimension I think that's worth thinking about here as well. Obviously, AI is starting to work its way through a number of organisations. As Anne said, a lot of it kind of happens from the ground up instead of the top down. So it comes from workers at a range of organisations, not just publications and news businesses, but all over the place, using tools like ChatGPT, often in a kind of uncontrolled way. But for the news business specifically, there's kind of like an interesting dynamic emerging here. You've got to view this not only in the context of the AI revolution, but also kind of the internet revolution that came before it. A lot of companies, be it News Corp or any number of other businesses around the world, were sort of caught flat-footed by the rise of businesses like Google and then by Facebook, and they were always chasing the ball rather than being in front of it.
That is a good description, they're trying to be basically in charge of change rather than responding, I think, James. We've run out of time. James and Ange, you're such a good panel. Thanks for joining us.
No worries, good to be here.
And that's afternoon briefing for today. So great to be back with you. Stay with us here on the ABC News channel. Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories. We live on iView, so you can catch up if you've just got the last bit there. Just search for afternoon briefing on iView. I'll see you tomorrow.